That would be what you'd put in.
Thank you, Mr. Schilling. Okay, on the suspension, those in favor use the voting sign aye.
Aye.
Opposers, nay. On the passage, those in voting sign aye.
Aye.
Opposers, nay. Motion carried.
Mr. President,
Yes.
did you have us vote for the emergency? I think we got a.
Oh, I'm sorry. On the emergency. Those in favor of the emergency use the voting sign aye.
President, now it's on the passage.
Pardon me?
Your first vote was on emergency.
Oh, okay, we did. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Clerk.
Now on the passage.
Those in favor of the motion of the passage use the voting sign aye.
Mr. President?
We just did that. I thought.
Yeah, could we restate the motion? And we are, just so everyone is clear and the audience is clear, we would be passing this ordinance as it's presented, not amending it at the request of Main Street Elyria's request to change the figures that are attached. Is that correct? Am I understanding that correct?
No, it was just for the emergency. We are amending for the emergency because Mrs. Byington said it has to be in by a certain
Okay.
date, so we had the emergency.
So we're going to pass it as an emergency. The actual document, though, once we get to the motion and voting on the actual document, we are not amending we have not had the discussion about amending the document per the Main Street request. Is that correct? I just want to make sure I understand.
Mr. Shields?
Mr. President.
I believe if Main Street wanted the numbers changed, no, you haven't dealt with that. The only motion I heard was to pass it as an emergency. The motion didn't say why. I think the motion needs to say why. Then you vote on amending the ordinance to include an emergency clause for the reason that it has to be submitted by January 15, 2010. Then you get into the discussion of the ordinance itself and whether you're going to amend the body of the ordinance in terms of the numbers.
Okay. Excuse me.
So
Your
you're,
motion
Mr.
was
President,
for the-
you're voting on the ordinance as amended.
I don't believe you've ever actually voted on the amending it for the emergency reason, and I believe that should be done now first, and then you get into whether you're going to go ahead with the ordinance.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I thought that we did vote on passage of the amendment
Yes, you did.
with the emergency clause as being stated by Mr. Schilling.
Correct.
Okay, if you did that, fine. I guess I didn't quite hear that.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
We did.
So now you're on the ordinance itself.
Okay. Now, on the ordinance, those in favor of the motion use the voting sign aye.
Call a question. You didn't call a question or discussion.
Is there?
I call a question. You can't call a question.
Call for a question.
Question on the motion. Those in favor of the motion use the voting sign aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Motion carried.
Nay.
Nay? One nay.
So noted, Mr. President.
Do we need a roll call for that?
No, but you do need to pass it. You know, you have not passed, you amended it to include an emergency. So all you've done is amended it. You have not voted to pass this ordinance as an emergency. You know, there's usually, when you do things on the first reading, you have three votes. One, to suspend the rules. Two, to vote, approve it as an emergency. Three, for passage. So right now, you've amended it to include an emergency clause. I believe this is its first reading. So somewhere along the line, you have to approve it, because I don't think the original motion did anything other than just do the emergency, didn't it, Mr. Callahan?
No, it did not. The original motion was for suspension of rules and passage. And at that point, after it was seconded, I made an amendment to include the word emergency.
Okay. To pass it, to put an emergency clause proper in. Now you go through a vote on whether you're going to suspend the reading, then whether you're going to pass it in emergency, then the passage of the ordinance as amended. So those are the three things that now have to be done. You've amended the ordinance to include an emergency clause to January 15th.
Would the president prefer I read it again, and then we vote on it?
Yes, Mr. Cannon, go ahead.
Okay. On this ordinance, I move that this ordinance be passed on its first reading under suspension of rules and declare an emergency.
Second.
Question.
Mr.
Okay,
President,
those in favor?
Mr. President?
Yes, Mr. Gibbs.
can I just add, interject some discussion just for a moment here? When the committees met, I mean, the majority of us are on the committee, so tell me if I'm wrong, but part of the committee that we passed, committee resolution or ordinance, was to give community development and Ms. Byington some lateral movement in these areas as far as budgetary concerns. So I think that if we're looking at, and we feel that cameras possibly might be a good way for enforcement downtown, I mean, you've got, we haven't restricted these dollars. So, I mean, you have target area enforcement, which could be any area in which we deem to be the target, as well as public facilities. I know we kept that very broad, very generic, so it gives lateral movement. Am I wrong in this area?
Through you, Mr. President. The target areas are designated by HUD based off demographics, so it's not our own target area. But you'd be correct that the downtown is within an eligible target area. The use of the money for cameras for safety services, with the main system being at the police station, that would be considered, in my opinion, a public service. And we have the cap on public service of $108,000. So if you wanted to put any money towards a camera or cameras, then it would be coming out of that $108,000. It couldn't come out of, we couldn't use public facilities and infrastructure. We couldn't use those dollars to pay for the cameras, because in my opinion, the cameras would be a public service. Did I answer your question, Mr. Gibbs?
But Mr. Chair, or Mr. President, through you, it could be, though, in the target enforcement area where we've got 80,000. I know when we had this discussion, we're looking at, when Captain had mentioned about an officer, we're looking at that's the total cost of an officer, put an officer back out on the beat or in the neighborhoods, whatever is 80,000. But I mean, that there, the way we're submitting this is once again still very broad, correct? I mean, we aren't tied in one way or another. I mean, these are dollars where we're going to spend in certain areas, but we haven't declared a line item on these.
We have, through you, Mr. President, declared a line item for police, so that's $80,000. And we have declared, this is all out of public service, fair housing for $12,000. And then for youth recreation for $16,000, which totals the $108,000. And we are required, those are different enough activities that we have to line item them in our plan.
Okay.
Mr. Callahan, you had something?
I was just, through you, Mr. President, was going to explain just what Mrs. Byington just explained. The portion of that comes out of the 15%, and the majority of that 15% is $80,000 set aside for a police officer. Now, the committee thinks that the idea of putting cameras is an excellent idea, but it would come at the expense of a police officer.
Thank you. Any other discussion?
Question.
Okay. This is under suspension. Those in favor of the motion, use the voting sign aye.
Aye.
Opposed is nay. Passes. On the passage, no, I'm sorry, on the emergency, as stated by the law director, those in favor of the motion, use the voting sign aye.
Aye.
Opposed is nay. On the passage, those in favor of the motion, use the voting sign aye.
Aye.
Opposed is nay.
Mr. President, I would be in favor of this now that I know the rest of the details behind it and would not object.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ordinance number 2010-03.
Okay.
Sponsored by the Community Development Committee and the Finance Committee. An ordinance authorizes the mayor to submit to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development and the Ohio Department of Development, Office of Housing and Community Partnership, the FY 2010 and 2014 Consolidated Plan and declaring an emergency.
Mr. President,
Yes, Mr. Callahan.
I move this ordinance be passed on its first reading under suspension of rules and declared an emergency.
Second.
Okay, move to second. Any discussion?
Question.
Question on the motion. On the suspension, those in favor, use the voting sign aye.
Aye.
Opposed is nay. On the emergency, those in favor, use the voting sign aye. Aye. Opposed is nay. On the passage, those in favor, use the voting sign aye. Aye. Opposed is nay. Motion carried.
Ordinance number 2010-04.